Thank you for tuning in to the Historic Restorations Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, historic-restorations.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historic home. If you've not yet done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. And also like us on Facebook at facebook.com/historic restorations. Welcome to the Historic Restorations Podcast, hosted by Danielle Kepperling. Historic Restorations is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Thank you for coming in to the Historic Restorations podcast. We're actually doing this interview in person, and today we have Chad Martin with us, the director of the National Fund for Sacred Places. Prior to his role at Partners, Chad was the pastor at Community Mennonite Church of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. During his pastoral tenure, the congregation developed an in-house art gallery, redeveloped an award-winning parking lot in accordance with the city's green infrastructure plan, and substantially increased building use by community partners. Prior to this, Chad was the ceramic studio coordinator at the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild in Pittsburgh. He served on several boards of directors in Pittsburgh and Lancaster, including as a founding board member of the Union Project, an example of best practice for adaptive reuse in the historic religious property. As an assistant moderator of the Atlantic Coast Conference, MCUSA, he has written articles on art and or theology and spirituality for several publications, including Ceramics Monthly, Worship, and Conrad Grebel Review. He is ordained for pastoral ministry in the Mennonite Church USA. Chad is a graduate of Goshen College, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and Leadership Lancaster. Chad, thank you for joining us for the Historic Restorations Podcast.
Absolutely. It's a delight to be with you.
Thank you. Again, how did you get started in preservation? I know you kind of came about it in a roundabout way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So as I was saying, kind of coming into this, I do not come at this work from a preservation background. Although I should say, I can maybe start that by saying what we do with the National Fund and at Partners for Sacred Places. So Partners for Sacred Places was formed as a nonprofit. We're a national nonprofit organization based in Philadelphia, formed in the late 1980s, so almost 30 years ago. And at that time, in the preservation world, there was this kind of brewing, there's kind of a brewing conflict and definitely a kind of robust conversation going on in urban centers like New York, Boston, Chicago, where there was kind of this tension between communities of faith, congregations and parishes, and the preservation community. It was kind of the first time in this country where you saw development pressures for property kind of wooing congregations to consider selling their buildings or selling air rights or those kinds of dynamics
for the real estate,
for real estate development, which and congregations that may have been struggling saw this as kind of an opportunity to endow their programs, for years into the future by selling valuable property, which was, of course, in direct tension with historic preservationists in those very same communities saying, even as development pressures increase, we want to be preserving buildings that matter to the community.
Right,
so those
and that
kind of came in
have
tension.
stood there for how long and have so much part of the community's history.
Well, exactly. So in places like New York and Boston, churches that have been there for 300 years or more in some cases.
Right.
So kind of out of that tension and, like a lot of kind of urban development things, New York was kind of leading the way with some of these conversations. Right. Out of that, Partners was formed as a nonprofit that tried to bridge that gap and some of that tension between the preservation community and the interests of congregations.
Right.
So that's a kind of long backstory to say that's kind of the backdrop of the work we do at Partners. So over the years, we have had a vested interest in how preservation can enable congregations and parishes to kind of follow their mission of serving their communities, rather than seeing, losing their buildings or selling buildings as a way to
continue their mission.
Yeah.
Do you work with, I know that another thing that happens, and I don't know if this is something that you directly work with, but the churches that get closed in those communities, do you work with those buildings then to find a suitable reuse?
Okay. Absolutely. So the program I direct is the National Fund, which is a new grant-making program funded by the Lilly Endowment in order to make large capital grants with congregations that are thriving but have preservation needs in their buildings.
Okay, so you're more that other end of the spectrum where there's people still attending, but they just don't have the money to upkeep necessarily that building.
And there, there's a wide range of capacity in there, but virtually every leader of a historic congregation will tell you, no matter how well endowed they are, there's always a need for more.
Right.
Preservation of buildings is expensive, and often for churches falls kind of to the bottom of the list. If they're choosing between giving money to programs that take care of basic human needs like food, clothing, shelter, if they're choosing between that and repairing the stained glass windows, usually they're going to do the program stuff and hope that someday they get to the windows.
Yeah, I know. One thing that really kind of opened my eyes to the role of churches in preservation, in promoting arts and all of that was St. James just underwent a big restoration project where they worked on safety. I went through a presentation where they talked about all the different things that they did to make it for future use, but also respecting the historic. And one of the things that Father David said was that churches, because I went on a field trip where they were making the clay tiles by hand still at the Mercer Tile Works. And he said churches have always promoted that kind of work. And he felt like it was his duty to be a patron and keep that skill and that craft going. And I thought that's really the type of work we do too. And it made me, it opened my eyes to the role of the church. And then I thought back of my history, of the Renaissance and all those painters and all of that whole thing. It kind of tied it together in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So historically, churches have been, literally kind of the temples at the center of civic life. The story of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, as you kind of alluded to, is that church participation has been declining. The kind of role of the Christian church, at least in civic life, is very different than it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And yet we still have these kind of vestiges to that era in the kind of physical buildings. So our work is really to step into that gap and say how, even as the religious landscape of the country changes, how can we continue to preserve these facilities as a community resource?
Right.
And usually now it takes more than just the members of the congregation to make that happen. It takes really a whole community saying this is a resource that matters to us.
And it's important.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which really, I'm sure puts it in line with many other preservation efforts. I mean, no preservation effort happens without a broad coalition.
Yeah, and there's often a discussion too of the economic impact of preservation. And I know in prepping for this, reading the economic, you even have things on the website talking about the economic impact of churches and communities. Yeah. And I had never thought about that, but that really is, is something that is valuable and should be highlighted so that people aren't just saying, oh, that's a building that doesn't pay taxes. It's, all of those things that go into those community discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're kind of hitting at the heart of a piece that has been really important to Partners. Very quickly in its early days at Partners in the late 80s, early 90s, these conversations started emerging about, well, why should we save these buildings?
Right.
Which pushed our staff back to articulating a narrative about why these places matter. And, when you're talking about, things like a tax base and increasing revenue for a city, cash-strapped cities looking for revenue wherever they can,
Right.
That quickly turned to an economic conversation.
Yeah.
So church folks aren't real used to speaking in economic
Right.
terms about the value of what they do. But I think that's one of the really important contributions our organization has made over the years. So going back to the kind of mid-90s, late 90s, our organization helped sponsor a major research project looking at the economic value of what churches provide. I say churches, but really communities of faith
Right.
of any religious tradition to their community. Not really, aside from everything they do that is the focus of their worship or religious life, looking at the economic impact of employing people in a community, kind of the effects of providing services that are often kind of appreciated by the community, but under the radar in terms of a dollar amount assessed of like, what's the true value of this? And then we did a major update to that research just in the last couple of years. And we've kind of dubbed that the economic halo effect, meaning, it kind of radiates out. It's not just what happens in the doors of the church, but in some cases, I just a couple months ago visited one of our awardees, which is a Catholic basilica in Milwaukee. It's an amazing facility. It actually, this is not very typical for religious buildings. It was like the most visited tourist site in Milwaukee.
Oh, really?
Like the highest rated by TripAdvisor for a couple of years.
Yeah.
So they're definitely a major asset to that community. And we did a halo study of the economic impact of the basilica in their community.
Yeah.
So one of the things we're looking at is, how many people, they're like a destination wedding venue because it's such a grand space. So people will come from out of town to have a wedding there. What's the economic impact of all the guests who come and spend a night there, buy meals there?
Right. Everything that goes into the wedding.
Yeah, all the baptisms that happen there, the extended family that come in, maybe from the broader region, maybe from even hours away.
Further,
so we, and we've worked to have conservative estimates of that so that we're not, so this isn't guesswork. But honestly saying, what's the economic kind of activity going on around that place? And in their case, it was in the millions of dollars annually that kind of ripple out from what they do as a basilica. That's not about the dollar spent on a baptism or the dollar spent on a wedding or a worship service, but it's all the dollars spent.
The people employed and all the things that go into making those celebrations. So that's become an important part of our work to help congregations tell their story well about why they matter to a broader community. Right.
And in some cases, in some of the cases where churches close, frankly, they don't matter a lot. They haven't figured out how to transcend all the changes around them to stay relevant to that community. And we try to be honest with communities when they're in that place too. But there are many historic congregations that continue to serve their communities in meaningful ways that are often kind of under the radar and not kind of seen by the broader community as fully as they could be.
It's very interesting to me to look at it, because that's oftentimes the way that they look at restoration, because restoration is so much more labor intensive than new construction, because you're going in and you're repairing things rather than buying new materials, so you're not just installing things. And looking at it through that lens, I can definitely see how a church, I had never looked at it that way, but how a church does impact the community and all the people around it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And even if folks aren't always fully aware of what happens inside the doors of a religious space, they become symbols to the community. So if they're lost to a community, how do you quantify what the loss is? And that transcends churches. That's a historic preservation.
Oh yeah. And that landmark building.
Yeah. What happens when we lose these landmark buildings? And of course, we can't save all of them. The preservation community is well aware of that. We can't save all of them.
But there are some that are worth definitely saving and preserving so that we have them into the future.
If I could, I wanted to circle back to your question about kind of how we work with churches
definitely.
that are not thriving and what happens with those buildings, because that is really one of the emerging kind of questions for an organization like ours, in the kind of changing religious landscape we live in right now. Increasingly, I think this is probably in every community across the country. It's definitively in every urban community across the country. There are grand historic church buildings that are in disrepair or facing challenges because either the congregation is dwindling and dying and ends up closing its doors. Maybe a church kind of sees the writing on the wall and they sell the building and another congregation steps in.
To move,
in some cases, and these in some ways are some of the real fun success stories of the work. In some cases, there's no longer a viable congregation that makes sense for a property, but it is still seen as a community asset. And so the community rallies to say, how can we kind of take ownership of this? That's really what I was a part of with the Union Project in Pittsburgh 10, 15 years ago.
So was the building, what did you transform it into, or how did you reuse it?
So that's a great kind of adaptive reuse story. That was a kind of crumbling church building. The actual bricks and mortar stories of like hauling trash. That could be a whole podcast itself, just the horror stories of bringing back to life a building that's been neglected for decades. Numbers of dead pigeons and things like that.
I've been there.
I'm sure you have. Probably everyone interested in this kind of conversation has been there. Well, first of all, the group who bought it was kind of just a group of community members who came together and had a vision for we literally walked by this church building every day to get to the bus stop and go to work. It was a symbol of our community, and yet it was just falling apart in front of our eyes.
And not even was it not being used?
There was technically a congregation of 5 people meeting around a space heater in a back room. But they had clearly become overwhelmed years ago, and it just was in total disrepair. This was years of sweat equity, but we built a nonprofit organization that was a kind of non-sectarian, not faith-based nonprofit organization. Although many of us came from kind of a perspective of communities of faith being important to our formation, came together to form a nonprofit organization and cast a vision of really developing it as a kind of multi-purpose community center. At the time, their vision, they still exist as an organization, and they still, have been taking good care of that building. The uses have kind of shifted a little bit over time as they've lived into their own vision, and the founders kind of stepped away. The original vision was around kind of arts, community, and faith. So early on, we did actually find a congregation that was looking for a home that was brought in as a tenant, and they're still there. But they're there as a tenant. They're kind of an equal partner at the table with all sorts of other nonprofits, community groups. So now it's used for an event space, a wedding venue. There are art studios in the basement. There are nonprofit offices in what would have been Sunday school rooms back in the day. And it really kind of came back to life as a community resource. And
so now the building's being used, it's used often. It's not just sitting there and just used one day a week that's what the building was meant to do.
So in many ways, it is serving the kinds of purposes it was built to do in the first place. 150 years ago, congregations had a kind of prominence in the community where they could do that all under their own umbrella, and they, people's lives revolved around the life of the church in a different way. That's just simply not true in many cases now. And so many of the same kind of services and activities happen there, but they're under an array of organizations that all are kind of there to serve the community. Some are faith-based and some aren't, and they find ways to kind of work alongside each other.
That made me think of even the parochial schools and those buildings sitting empty now. And there is space there that could be used. And I know that probably falls kind of outside of what you do, because you focus just on the...
although very closely aligned.
But I'm thinking I know just in Lancaster, there's several buildings that are sitting empty that, could have some kind of community center support kind of thing.
Well, and I think truly, Lancaster, I was saying this is going on in every community across the country. It is certainly happening in Lancaster. So I've lived here 10 years, been here longer. If I think of just the 10 years I've been here, I have seen historic churches sold by their founding congregation to another congregation. I've seen that happen 3 or 4 times just in the 10 years I've been here. I see churches that I know there are only a handful of people showing up on Sunday morning. And, someday really soon that church is going to be on the market.
Right.
And we're all going to wonder, well, how are we going to deal with that huge kind of landmark building in our community? And we've seen others, this is one of the interesting things. This certainly happens in other urban centers too. There have been at least 2 and maybe 3 just in Lancaster that have been converted to high-end residences.
Yes.
So Partners' vision is it is best if these are restored as community assets, really for the community. Mm-hmm. But there are cases where we kind of walk alongside, churches that end up being kind of abandoned. The kind of saddest stories are when they are demolished.
Yeah.
But it certainly happens, and I think increasingly there's a very real kind of earnest reality that we have to be strategic. We, meaning everyone involved in this work, about which places can be saved with integrity and which ones probably can't, because there are just too many kind of influx. Right now.
And there are, and I went through the parochial school system in Lancaster, and if you look at the number of Catholic churches that are in close proximity to each other, and because they were built for different ethnicities or different congregations, different nationalities, that's very hard to sustain. And those are hard conversations to have, because if you don't have enough people attending to sustain it, and you get to that point where are you going to, the building's worth preserving, but what can you do? Can it stay in this form, or does it need to transform? Yeah. And I think, if you go kind of through the criteria for a national landmark, I'm sure most of them would be on the registry.
Yeah.
But then you have to kind of think, was this, tied to, I know you have Christ Church as one of the ones that you funded.
Yeah.
That is definitely a national, tied to our national history. But then you have the other ones that are still very important because they're tied to people's history, but maybe they're not as noteworthy, and they didn't have the famous people. Yeah. And that is a balance. And I think that would be really hard because the buildings are mostly all beautiful, and even in disrepair are beautiful. There's I don't know if you're familiar, there's a book that's like Abandoned Places, and I can't think of the author's name, but he went into these places, and there's one church in Philadelphia that he went to every day as it was being demolished, and it's just even those pictures are beautiful, as half the building's gone.
Yeah, the photography can be beautiful, but the place is heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And I don't envy the position you're in. We usually get involved when people are ready to save something. We don't have to make those hard decisions.
Help decide.
Yes.
Well, and we don't really either. I mean, although with the grant making program, we're often in the same boat of we come alongside whenever we can.
Yeah.
Although with the grant-making program, we do face these hard choices. So with the National Fund, this was created to speak into all the things we're describing and it actually get some financial resources to these congregations. But even still, we're funding like 12 across the country each year. That really...
Now, how many applications do you get?
So we're in our second year of the program. The first year was kind of an invitation-only round. Mm-hmm. So we have about 2 weeks to go until our due date for the first kind of fully open application round, where we marketed this across the country. So it's still a little bit yet to be seen, but it's looking like we will have something like 100 plus applications and for about 12 slots.
Those are hard choices.
And behind those 100, there's probably another 1,000 that would technically qualify for our program. But do they rise to the top is the most important.
Right.
So I should tell a couple stories though. You mentioned Christ Church, and it reminds me of kind of the range of places we do find, because you're exactly right. So we have to be strategic with the one kind of, we look at a couple factors. We're going for a building that's really significant, maybe in a couple different ways. Mm-hmm. That might be architecturally significant. The history of the congregation might be significant. So in the case of Christ Church in Philadelphia, it kind of hits both of those at about the top, or however you want to rank that, they're at the top of both. of those. Ben Franklin is buried in their burial ground. The building is this amazing kind of colonial era building. But the other piece that's really important to us, and this goes back to the kind of research we were talking about earlier, and I think really the whole preservation community is moving this way too, where the kind of line, I've even heard Stephanie Meeks, the director of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, kind of uses this line frequently that, this is not just kind of about bricks and mortar and preserving these places,
right,
kind of completely outside of their context. It's about taking care of spaces that still matter to their community.
And I think too, at least in the preservation community in Lancaster and the organizations, there's an organization's just devoted to saving places, and then one that's devoted to more of the people's stories. And I think to marry those two would really make more people realize that preservation is about all of our history. It's collective.
Yeah. So Christchurch is a great example because for all their noteworthiness architecturally and historically, there are other churches that rise to that level in the country. But one of the real standout features of Christchurch is they have really worked hard over the last couple decades to be completely relevant as a community resource for Philadelphia.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. That's great.
Oh, it's a fantastic story. One of the ways they have done that is opened their, it's called Neighborhood House, but it would be kind of the parish house that was adjacent to the church building. They, which is historic in its own right, but it's 125 years old or something like that. They have fully restored and updated that facility to be used as a multi-purpose venue, mostly as a theater venue.
Oh, so that's interesting. Yeah.
These numbers aren't exact, but because it's off the top of my head, but it's something on the order of 150 plus arts organizations have used their facility as a venue in the last year.
Oh, that's great. So that's
it's
every other day.
Almost every day. There's a theater group in their building either rehearsing or performing.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. This 300 plus year old congregation that has this weight of history that on its own it would be reasons to put lots of money into saving it.
Right.
What really puts it over the top is the way they have worked. And as a former pastor, this is what matters to me more than just kind of a place that mattered in history.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that. Do you feel like that brings you a different perspective?
Totally.
Yeah.
So we have other staff who come from a much more kind of traditional preservation background. And I really respect and learn, as a newcomer to this work, I learn a lot from what they teach me.
Right.
But that being said, my perspective is often, driven by what's the impact of these congregations now, and not just in kind of traditional social service ways, but are they finding innovative, dynamic ways to engage with their community?
Yeah, I think that's that is an interesting perspective, and I think that in this type of work in preservation and having the different perspectives then helps everybody see. That it's not just a static place in history; it's an evolution, and it's how and the impact now is just as important. If we can balance both, and honor both.
Yeah, so that's a real important piece for our program. We're constantly looking for kind of both of those pieces. And we end up saying no to some projects who don't understand why we said no to them, because they're like, but don't you understand how important this building is?
Right.
Yes. And you're not doing anything with it right now.
Yeah.
So it's really important to us that it's continuing to serve its community. That being said, there are also these other situations, Christchurch that I was just describing, they're a great example of they have lots of resources and there's always a need for more. So we're stepping in to help with more. But really, they have access to a lot of resources. We work with some others that are in really tenuous situations. So I think of a really wonderful little African Methodist Episcopal Zion congregation in North Carolina that we're funding this year. And they got on our radar because they've been out of their building for 10 years. Because it suffered hurricane damage.
Oh, goodness.
And they got on our radar because they were listed as one of the most endangered places by the National Trust a few years ago. So the National Trust kind of brought them to the table. they have capital needs beyond what they can muster themselves.
What they need to.
Even though they have continued to thrive, they've been meeting kind of off location for 10 plus years.
And they're still...
Yeah, they continue to thrive, continue to serve their community in lots of important ways. This was a church built by kind of prominent African-American freedmen, soon after the Civil War. The congregation was formed in the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. The church was built in like the 1890s by one of the most prominent African-American families in that community in North Carolina.
So it's a lot of history too.
There's a lot of history there. And it's a more kind of simple looking kind of country North Carolina church, but what an important place historically.
And from a historical perspective, because I'm sure at that time then it was the education center and the community center and everything else that Reconstruction era required.
Exactly. It's a classic kind of Reconstruction era story. White folks from the North came down and started a school next door, and eventually, the same African-American builder built the school next door. And so all these, and what an amazing legacy too a community that probably was severely kind of lacking in resources and had kind of every obstacle in the way, and still built a beautiful little church.
And that was probably their safe place too. Within the community. That's really, it's not as prominent, but it's definitely an important piece of our history.
Yeah. And the goal is, in that case, the goal is to get them back in that building so that they can kind of reestablish that sense of home.
Yeah. How do you work with the congregations then? Do you do like a matching funds, or how does that process work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our grant-making program has a couple different pieces to it. So one, and this is kind of the hook for everyone, is the big capital grant. Of course, they would all love to get $250,000 from us. And anyone who's awarded in the program, the goal is sincerely to get them that kind of money. But along the way, we do a lot of capacity building and kind of assistance with the project. So we have small planning grants that help pay for things like architectural fees.
The project development.
Project development, all those things that add up for any project along the way. And those are modest-sized planning grants, but it's the goal is to at least have enough in the planning grants to kind of encourage them to do all that good professional project work.
Right.
And then we also, each congregation is expected to participate in a group training. We do a couple different levels of that, but the kind of basic one is simply like, how do you run a good capital campaign as a church?
Oh, yeah.
Many of these congregations have not done a capital campaign in a generation or maybe ever.
Right.
And, that North Carolina church is they're doing great. They're a hardworking church, but, they don't have a big budget, and they're looking at like $1 million to be able to get back in the building.
Right. And that's for a smaller congregation, that's very daunting.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
So just getting them some basic kind of tools for how do you set up an effective campaign, and all the while encouraging them to get professional help with that too.
Right. And I was thinking too, that was what I was thinking, could they even, plan stages so that they're protecting the building, and that's how we approach it. So you stop all the water and elements from getting in, and then you're stabilized, and then you can kind of move forward from that. And then that kind of gives people encouragement too, that they're actually making progress.
Yeah, exactly. Some projects are kind of a once and done thing, and some are kind of phased. And then we also wrap in some kind of customized consulting services that again are often either in the realm of capacity building or using a kind of set of skills and expertise that our staff have to help them get a step down the road with something related to kind of their building and their mission. That can be really wide-ranging. Our staff bring a real wide variety of experiences, everything from very traditional kind of preservation considerations to capital campaign expertise to expertise in kind of training up the congregation on, if you want to share your space more for community life, how do you do that?
Right.
How do you kind of make that part of who you are? So we'll step in and offer a few days of kind of free consulting work as part of
That's very. I think that's probably very important too. And do you do that for the grant recipients or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So kind of the idea is, we were talking earlier about kind of 12 slots out of those 100 plus or whatever. So they apply for the program, and we award a cohort into the program. This year it'll probably be 12. Yeah. And then each of those 12 get everything I just described.
Okay, that's very, very cool. Well, that's very interesting. Did you have anything else that you wanted to share, or I feel like we've covered a lot of things.
Great question. I don't think so. I think that's an okay place. I mean, we could follow lots of rabbit trails.
I think we've covered what you do and why you do it, and why it's so important to not just the congregation, but to the greater community. How can our audience get a hold of you?
Oh, great question. Partners for Sacred Places is the organization I work for, and we have a website, which is sacredplaces.org. So they can visit that website and learn about the array of things we do, from training and consulting to grant making. The program that I direct is the National Fund, and it has its own kind of standalone website. I should say that program is in partnership with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is the largest national preservation organization. The website for the National Fund is fundforsacredplaces.org. My phone number is on the partners website. My email is on both websites. So I'm always glad to talk to people more about this.
Very good. Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming in and speaking with me.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Historic Restorations Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at historic-restorations.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that would get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Historic Restorations Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit us at historic-restorations.com.